Okay, right. So today I'm going to sort of talk to you a little bit about some of my research, none of which that is published at the moment, on trying to understand the evolutionary history of some fish in central Mexico, which involves a lot of, or has involved a lot of visualization. Some of the stuff that I'm showing you relates to some of the work I did as a postdoc when I was in the States at this place called the National Evolutionary Synthesis Center in North Carolina. So some of it's to do with the software that I wrote there. Some of it's to do with ongoing stuff. Some of it is just stuff that I did a few weeks ago. So it's sort of, right up to date. Anyway, what I'll hopefully illustrate is some of my efforts to visualize this data. And hopefully at the end, I can give you a few pointers to say the things that I've learnt while trying to undertake this type of visualization and understand these data types. It's going to be a very steep learning curve because I've got to teach you a little bit about evolution, a little bit about Mexico and its geological history, a little bit about trees, evolutionary trees, and how we can visualize them before we can actually get onto the story about the history of fish and the history of the landscape. Anyway, we'll see how well we get on. So I'll probably undoubtedly go over the time. Okay, so Mexico. Don't know how familiar you are with Mexico. It's one of the most biodiverse parts of the world that there is. Very high levels of biodiversity. It's geographically part of North America, not South America or Central America. So all of Mexico here is part of the North American geological plate. But why it's highly diverse is because roughly about 7 to 10 million years, it all depends on the estimations, North and South America met together, forming the Isthmus of Teotihuacan, or whatever it's called. Excuse me, these Mexican names are so unpronounceable and unreadable that I will make my best efforts. But when North and South America crashed together and they joined together, the biota, the animals and plants of South America could start migrating into North America, and those from North America can start migrating into South America. So you've got something called the Great American Interchange, where you've got organisms from south going north, north going south. And Mexico, being at the join, has organisms from both north and south, plus its own diverse endemic flora and fauna, organisms that have evolved and only live in Mexico. So that's why it's such a highly diverse, very biodiverse area. Geographically, or topographically, so this is a topographical map, elevation map. We've got this is the Pacific here, the Gulf of California. So we've got a sort of coastal plain on either side. This is the Atlantic coast over here. So we've got a coastal plain along the Atlantic, coastal plain, narrow coastal plain along the Pacific. And then we've got a high plateau across most of Mexico itself. So we've got a plateau here across a high plateau in central Mexico, bounded on the west or the east by the Sierra Madre Oriental mountains, and on the west by the Sierra Madre Occidental. These two mountain ranges formed in the Oligocene period, roughly 30 million years ago. These two mountain ranges formed. Then more recently, about 15 million years ago, if we look here, it's not particularly clear on this map. So we've got this mountain range going there, that side of the plateau, this mountain range going that side of the plateau. We also have another mountain range here, which includes the famous volcanoes, the one you first saw on the initial erupting there, Popocatépetl, but also there's a whole string of volcanoes along here. And there's this line of mountains going east-west is called the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt, and it's one of the most geologically, volcanically active areas of the planet today. So basically, think of Mexico, coastal plateaus, sorry, coastal plateaus, rivers running down out of the mountains off the Mexican plateau down to the sea either side. Then we've got mountain ranges on the east and west side of the plateau and also the south side of the plateau. Okay, so that's generally think of that as your general geography of Mexico, central Mexico. And I'm mostly working in the area between about here and here, so not the entire Mexico. This is kind of my study area in here. Why Mexico? When I worked in St Andrews on European bush crickets, a colleague, a friend, the guy I worked with, my PhD supervisor, has a very good friend who works on the Mexican fish, so I got to meet him, and we got on all right, and he was interested. He's a behaviorist geneticist, which means he studies how the genetics of fish determines their behavior and how their mating behavior leads to speciation. So he's interested in things like sexual selection and how that drives speciation in fish. But we also believe that there was a strong component of the history of the landscape in the evolution of the fish, and he didn't know anything about that, so hence we started working together. Okay, this area that I'm working in has a complex geological, hydrological and biological history. It's very dynamic, as I say. Over the last 15 million years, you've got a mountain range with volcanoes that are 14,000 feet high. So you can get basically whole mountain ranges are formed in the period that I'm talking about. So this is just a slide that sort of summarizes some of the information that I have on some of the processes going on in the landscape. So obviously, I've mentioned we've got volcanoes exploding. And indeed, most of the landscape, most of the elevation is the result of volcanic eruptions and the piling up of lava beds rather than tectonic. You know what I mean by tectonics? The plates moving together and squashing like that. So it's mostly eruptive or eruptions that cause the mountains to build in the landscape. So I've got information on the geology, and quite a few years back now, I went to visit this guy, Luca Ferrari, actually an Italian citizen who works at UNAM campus in Chiquita, and I got a detailed geological map from him, and the geological data that I'm going to show you later on comes from Luca Ferrari. I've also got information. All right, so we've got these volcanoes sending out lava, etc., etc. Unsurprisingly, because it's a tectonic actively area, we've also got tectonic faulting of the landscape. So we've got faults forming, the formation of things called graben, where the landscape, you've got two faults here, the landscape's been pulled apart on either side and the block in the middle's fallen down. So the landscape is the product of both volcanics, tectonic change, and also erosion. As the landscape gets higher, the erosive forces get more powerful. And things like, here we've got an example, this is sort of the first time, this is the second time, and we've got things called river capture events going on. So here we've got one river channel with a steeper channel draining this way, and we've got another river draining this way. This is eroding, what we call headward erosion. It's eroding itself, the stream head is eroding backwards. Eventually this channel erodes into this one, and the flow, instead of going this way, once this steeper channel is eroded in there, the water starts flowing this way, and this channel becomes truncated. So we've got eruptions, we've got tectonics, we've got erosion going on, restructuring where the rivers run. And this is some of the data that we have on where the rivers were at various periods in the past. So the chief, well, I don't know whether he's still alive anymore, but a guy called Techena used to be chief engineer, water engineer for Mexico City, providing the water, the drinking water for Mexico City. He had a hobby of mapping paleo river channels. And he drew some sketch maps in the mid-80s that this data's derived from. And basically it's showing the major river channels where they were flowing in the Miocene. So the Miocene is roughly 12 million years ago, mid-Miocene, 12, 13 million years ago. Predominantly the flow of water was from north to south. trans-Mexican volcanic belt is basically running through here. The details of it don't really matter. Then we got, as you can see, there was a bit of change here. This river that used to flow down there, we now think flowed down like that. So there was a slight change. There was a change in the way the river was flowing. In the Pliocene, roughly 5 million years ago, a huge lake formed in the, or a lake and boggy area formed on the plateau. So we had a large, low, relatively shallow lake across a large amount of the central Mexican highlands, which obviously facilitated fish dispersing around the lake. And also, lakes are very important for fish because I don't know whether you're aware of things like African lake cichlids, where you can get huge radiations in speciation. So lots of species forming in very short periods of time in lakes as a result of specialization to sort of lake margin versus central lake habitats, and also driven by sexual selection. Sexual selection is basically where females and males choose each other differentially, okay? So, and therefore, if you always choose the same type of organism or type to mate with, eventually you can diverge into different species. So, for example, let's say we've got one species of fish which either has a sort of red morph or a green morph, so it could either be green or red. And if the green fish prefer to mate with green fish, eventually they will diverge into a species of green fish separated from the red fish. Okay, that's sexual selection. That can go on within the same environment. Just to make it even more complicated, we've got climate on top of this. So we've got changes in rainfall over periods of millions of years, which leads to increased lake depths. So we may have separate lakes, then we get a wet period, and those lakes join together. And basically, to try and understand the history of the fish in the landscape, we have to understand the history of the landscape. Okay, so that's the idea. So we've got climate, we've got volcanics, we've got tectonics, we've got erosion. And here's just a few photos to show some of the landscape that we've got. It's a very mountainous, here's the edge of the plateau. This is towards the edge of the plateau, and we've got here's the River Santiago, the Rio Santiago, coming through a canyon down out off the plateau. Here's Lake Chapala, which is the remnant of that ancient, very large paleo lake. It's still several hundred miles long, Lake Chapala, but it's the remnant of a larger paleo lake system. Here's the plate, all the rivers. The rivers have lots of waterfalls as a result of the faulting and the volcanic activity. So there's loads of waterfalls, which may well be barriers to fish movement and lead to isolation below and above the waterfalls, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And here's Mexico, or the city of Tenochtitlan, which is the Aztec city, or the original Aztec city that evolved into Mexico City with the invasion of the Europeans, which was actually a city in one of these lake systems. It was actually built on top of a lake system. So we've got so it's just a few photos to give you a bit of consequence. Image from Google Earth. This is showing how volcanism, this is an example of how volcanism changes the hydrological connectivity, the connectivity of the river channels. This is Lake Ziroan in Michoacán province. So the water is flowing this way into the lake. So it used to flow down here. What happened was roughly, I don't know when this occurred, but this, if you can see this shape here, these curved shapes here, that's the top of an eruption, a volcanic eruption. All the lava poured out, blocked this river valley. It solidified, forming these, these kind of wave-like, that's the shape of the surface of the lava flow. This blocked this river channel, which used to flow down here, forming Lake Ziroan. So Lake Ziroan is the result of this the river channel, which originally drained through here like this, getting blocked by a volcanic eruption. So the fish that lived in this river channel used to be able to swim up and down like that, but now can't because there's a great big volcanic eruption in the way. And that's just one example. We've got whole loads of examples where we've got these kinds of eruptions blocking river channels and resulting in changes in the water flow. So that's just one example of that. Interestingly, I've got a photograph from about the 1930s of this same place, and you can really see there's a lot less vegetation over the lava flow in the 1930s than there is now. So I think this probably formed maybe 150 years ago, a couple of hundred years ago. That's probably the time scale that we're looking in for the formation of Lake Zerwan. So effectively almost within living memory. Across this landscape live lots of animals and fish. And I've got data for a variety of groups of fish and also some parasites within the fish. And what I'm going to talk to you today is about the group of fish called the Gudeidae, which is a group of roughly about 31 species that are all related to each other. But also within this landscape, we've got other groups of fish, things like minnows. These are called sword tails. And within the fish, we've got various parasites. This is a parasitic nematode that lives in various species within the Gudeids. Okay. And basically, people have gone out, my colleagues go out, they collect these fish, they take DNA samples, and then they run them through DNA sequences, and they build evolutionary trees so that we understand how these various species are related to each other. And this is the distribution of the Gudeidae across central Mexico. The size of the dots is indicating how many species are found at each location. So you can see, here's the Trans-Mexican volcanic belt running east-west here. Here are these large volcanoes, Mount Colima, various other ones. And we can see the center for biodiversity for this group of fish is kind of in this area here, but they extend down towards the Pacific coast. We've got an isolated group of a couple of species up here, and we also get them extending over towards the Adriatic. So that's roughly the distribution of the species of Gudeidae. And this is one of the evolutionary trees that have been created through the analysis of their DNA. So are you all familiar, happy with evolutionary trees? Sorry? It's a sort of cluster analysis, yes. They use special, this is the result. It is a type of cluster analysis, but it's a special type of cluster analysis. But you read it like this. Here are the names of all the species that are alive today, all the ones that were analysed. And we can take, say here, we've got two species, G. multiradiatus and G. viviparus. They're just G because I can't say the word, the name of the genus. These two are more closely related to each other than this species. So you go up the tree and you say these two are more closely related than this one, but then you go to this node and you see these three are more closely related to each other than this group over here. Okay. And what I've done here is I've taken this tree and we've highlighted these nodes, 5 nodes called DH. This is a species N and M. And in a paper that was published that included this tree, the sort of things that you get published in journals is the tree and then some sort of generalization, some kind of map that goes with the tree. But it's very difficult to show the distribution of 30 species on one map. So what tends to happen is people draw maps of interesting groups. So for example, here, the Gudea, this one that has this shading, it's rather difficult to tell. In here is the distribution of this species. This style here, down towards the south, is the distribution of clade D, which is the distribution of all the species under this node. So all this species, that's the combined distribution. This striped area is the combined distribution of all these species. So it's kind of difficult to put a map, to map this information. You've got 30 odd species, and you've got the number of tips minus 1 added onto that for the number of internal nodes. So you've got about 60 distributions to display on a map to show all the information in this tree, and those distributions are not independent of each other, because the distribution of node H encompasses all the distributions of all these other taxa as well, species as well. So there's a hierarchical in the distribution. So how does the biology work? So though each of these branches represents a speciation event, okay? So we had an ancestor here that speciated into Xenotoca einsteii and Xenotoca melosoma. And we can do that at all nodes, so we can go back here and we say event C, or node C, was a speciation event between the species, the ancestors, that eventually diverged into all these other species. Okay. So how does speciation occur, and what's its relationship to geography? Well, it's believed that the biggest driver of speciation, divergence, is geographic isolation. Okay, so here's two examples, well, one example of geographic, or two examples of how geographic isolation can result in speciation. In what's called the vicariance model, that's a hideous word, but vicariance model, we have a widespread ancestor species. Something happens, so this is a fish, maybe in the lake. Then a new barrier forms that splits the range of that species. And because the individuals in the two regions, the new two regions, so this is split, we've had some new watershed form, maybe we've had an eruption with that, a lava flow that's blocked a river channel. So now the species can't, fish can't move up and down the river anymore. Because they can't interbreed with each other, they start to differentiate, and eventually they speciate. So if we have an ancestor, a widespread ancestor, a new barrier forms, splits the range of the ancestor into two. There's no movement, no interbreeding between these two areas. Eventually we get new species. So the pattern we see today as a result of a new watershed forming is that we've got one species here, and these are related to each other. Their most recent common ancestor, as we say, is this. So this is time. So that's back in time. This is the present day. So this species split, its range was split, and then it diverges into two different species. But we can get the same result by the species dispersing over an existing barrier. So in this case, we haven't had a new barrier formed. The barriers existed all the time, but the ancestor has actually managed to disperse over that barrier. Perhaps the famous one when it comes to fish is eggs on birds' feet. So a bird is paddling around on this side of the barrier, ends up swallowing some, or having some fish eggs somewhere stuck on its feet, on its mouth, or something like that. They manage to get taken over into the other watershed. So this is one watershed or watershed. Because dispersal like that is very rare, it's a sort of one-off event, then you are going to end up with them, because they are effectively isolated, even though there was one historical dispersal event, they slowly diverge. So this results, so we get this pattern with similarly related species either side of a barrier. We've got two ways in which we can create the same pattern today. Is that kind of clear, roughly? Roughly. Okay. But speciation can also happen in other ways as well. So we can have an ancestor, and then we might have an environmental decline, an ecological change in temperature, climate, environment. And because certain of the individuals, basically the individuals in the ancestral range can adapt to these different environmental conditions through time. They may differentiate across the cline because this one's adapted to, say, the lake margin, and this one's adapted to the middle of the lake. Okay. So therefore you end up with species that are next door to each other and have adjacent ranges as a result of not a new barrier forming, but due to a change in ecological conditions. We can also get differentiation occurring without any geographical differentiation, where we've got this sexual selection going on, and the classic example is lake cichlids. So that's where the red ones mate with the red ones and the green ones mate with the green ones. Through time, they will diverge because the red ones don't mate with the green ones and the green ones don't mate with the red ones. Right. Finally, rivers. Rivers are, here we've got this river capture event, remember? We've got a river flowing down here. We've got another stream here, eroding upwards, eroding in this direction, headward erosion. Eventually that cuts into this river channel, so instead now the water flows this way rather than that way. This results in the fish in this river. Some of them are now still in that river, part of the river, but other ones can now join this river. What this means from a fish perspective, and this is, if you're not used to reading trees, so this is Heatherdale Creek, this one, the grey, Heatherdale Creek, and Mullum Creek is B. So if we had a species in Heatherdale, what happens is that this part of Heatherdale becomes part of Mullum. Okay? So that's this part of the area A, or becomes part of the other watershed. So some of the species, some of the fish that were in that area in Heatherdale, some of them stay in Heatherdale, some of them in Mullum, but these can't, there's no dispersal between these, so they start to differentiate. The ones that have come over, that were in the top part of Heatherdale, can now start to disperse down Mullum, and anything in Mullum can start dispersing upstream into Heatherdale. So we end up with this kind of situation. So we start off with one species A in Heatherdale, one species B in Mullum. The species in Mullum, all it can do is disperse into the area of Heatherdale that is now joined with Mullum. Whereas the one that was in Heatherdale, those that joined Mullum are now isolated from the ones in Heatherdale, start to differentiate. So we end up with this type of situation at the end of the day, where we've got one species derives a new species there, a new species there, and the old species in Mullum has just expanded its area. So this is a combination, a river capture event is a combination of a vicariance and a sort of dispersal event within the river basin. Bottom story is, I don't expect you to learn all those, the bottom line is the same pattern that you observe today can be the product of different histories. Okay, so you can get to the same, it may be that this is the most likely situation, that you had a wide-bred ancestor that became differentiated like that, but you ultimately don't know because there are lots of processes that can result in the same pattern. But there is all this pattern. Because organisms behave in respect of landscape changes in similar ways, so if you've got two groups of species, therefore there is common pattern. So if we've got two groups of species, so this is a mountain range example. So each of these is a evolutionary tree, and we're looking, time is going upwards here. So this is the ancestor, this is the modern day. And we can see a mountain range formed here that split the ranges of these three, the grey, the red, and the black, what we call clades. When I say clade, I mean a tree. And we can see that because that mountain range split the populations of all these three groups, or two of these groups anyway, the black and the grey, that we've got the same kind of pattern either side of the mountain. There's one deep division, which was the result of the mountain forming in the grey and the red and black trees. So we've got a whole group of black species, related species, this side of the mountain, whole group of grey species together this side of the mountain. The other side, we've got a different group of closely related black species and a different group of closely related grey species. So we can get the same pattern in multiple species because they react to the same historical event splitting their ranges. And this diagram attempts to show some of the patterns that biogeographers are interested in to try and understand, well, first of all, what is the pattern today? And then to try and say, well, what was the history that resulted in that pattern today? So we look for example, differences between sister clades within a tree. What's a sister clade? A sister clade is simply the two, as I say, think of a clade as a subtree. Okay, so this side, this side of the mountain, all this group of species are closely related to each other, and they are on this side, these two species are closely related to each other. So we're looking for this pattern whereby we've got a whole group of closely related species, one side of a barrier, and a whole group the other. Okay, and we're doing that between more than one clades. We're looking for congruence between these divisions. We've got no species there on the mountain range. Is that spatially concordant with a mountain range? We can look for all sorts of other things as well. But these are the kinds of patterns that we're looking for. Groups of the space occupied by the subtrees or clades or the subclades of multiple organisms. Right, okay. All right, this is the same thing. This is showing how the same end pattern, this is just a simple example. We've got one tree, here's our ancestor, split into A and D, and then D split into B and C. And it's just showing you that we can end up with the same end result through different histories. So we can't take the present pattern and automatically rewind history to try and understand history. Okay, so that's the biology and the basics of Mexico. So how are people involved? That's quite a lot of information to take on board. So this is how have people looked at how to visualize these patterns in space and time in the past. Godfrey Hewitt unfortunately died last year. He was a lovely guy, really nice guy from University of East Anglia. In 2001, he produced this paper, which was a sort of it was a sort of historical and a sort of reminiscence on how he's explored patterns in trees in geographical space in the past. And he drew this little diagram that goes back to Darwin, 1859, with the only illustration in The Origin of Species, which is a picture of a tree. So that was the earliest depiction. Well, it's not quite the earliest evolutionary tree, because Lamarck earlier created evolutionary trees, through sort of to the present day, and we can see how more and more information has been put onto these trees and how different information has been displayed in different ways on the trees. Some of which are biological. Here's the Canary Islands, and this is to do with this diagram is showing historical rates of dispersal between the various Canary Islands, and he's sort of just provided a sort of historical description of the various ways in which information has been attached to evolutionary trees, in particular spatial information. And maybe you can see, well, I think the take-home message from this is pre-digital, so to speak. This is everything being done on a tree by evolutionary scientists. That's the way this is viewed. And my work starts sort of after that, 2000 and well, I suppose I probably started this about 2005, 2006, starting about this. And I started to think, well, I mean, how do we put this information into a geographical information system? How do we display it so that we can see more of this information, we can interact with it? That was the challenge. Now, there are basically three ways to visualize geography on a tree. So we've got a tree model and we've got geography associated with each of the nodes, the tips of the nodes or the internal nodes of the tree. How can we do it? Well, there are three basic ways we can do it. One is we can take the tree, use the tree, and then put the geography on the tree. So we use the tree and then we attach the geography to the tree. The second thing we can do is we can take a tree and we can take the map and we can provide a mapping between the two. Okay, we can connect the two graphically. The third thing we can do is to take the tree and put the tree over the geography. And that's what I do. I take the trees and I put them into the geography, whereas the tradition, going back to Hewitt, is very much putting the geography on the tree. They're evolutionary scientists, they're obsessed by trees. I'm a geographer, I'm obsessed by maps, so I take it the other direction. And the map tangle is a kind of halfway, well, it's not even a halfway house. So let's see some of these examples. What can we do? Well, geography as a tree annotation is very straightforward. We put labels on our trees to say what the geography is. So we could just put words. So this species here is found in the north and the east areas. This one's just in the east, that one's the south and the east, that one's the west. We can display it as symbols. So this is the same information being displayed simply with the symbols on the terminal nodes of each tree. We can also put a grid. So we've got the tree, and then we put colour in the blocks. So we can say this one's in the east, this one's not in the east. Or we could put some kind of schematic mini map. So this is 4 different ways of displaying the same information as geography on a tree, but it's just labels for areas, okay? So this is just a label. And then the question becomes, well, what is north? What is north on a map? What does north look like on a map? What does south look for? Do you have to be entirely within south to be south, or can you have 5% overlap with north and you're called south? You know, you have to have various rules for how you when you say a distribution meets a particular descriptive area. So there are all sorts of problems with that, and it works quite well when you've got 4 areas, but if you've got 20 areas that you're describing, it becomes a lot more complicated and difficult to do. Here's an alternative, which I really like, and is kind of to a certain extent, it's been one of the inspirations for a lot of my research. It's not a great scan here, but so here we've got a tree here. So here's our evolutionary tree. And here we've got a set of maps, and the maps go with each node. Okay, so here for node A, all the species in this, maybe this side on this tree, but that side of that line, and all the species, these species, are that side of that line, yep? So we draw these lines between those groups of species ranges, and then we can draw them on the tree nodes, and then we can sort of line up lots of trees with similar lines on them. We can say, where does this type of line appear on multiple trees? Okay, so that's another way of putting geography onto a tree that's a bit more complicated than just having labels for areas. Here's a map tangle. Name map tangle comes from is a sort of, is derived from the idea of what's called a tanglegram. Okay, so a tanglegram is where you take 2 evolutionary trees and you try and map the organisms on each evolutionary tree. So this is a tree of water birds, penguins, loons, herons, cormorants, and this is a tree of parasitic somethings, I don't know what they are, mites, that live on birds. And we can see that game fowl So Oxylipiurus, or whatever it is, lives on game birds. Pteridogambus lives on cormorants. You can see we got Anatocolia live on flamingos, but another species also lives on ducks. And this is showing what we call the co-evolutionary relationships between these organisms. These mites live on the birds and they co-evolve with the birds. So this is a way of showing how well parasite trees map onto species trees, the host trees. Our map tangle is simply a tree and a map. So this is divergence of various bacteria. So this is bacteria in the water along the east coast of the USA. Here's the evolutionary tree drawn over here. And you see, instead of it being another tree that we're connecting to, we're connecting to the sample locations. So we've got the tree in tree space, we've got the map in map space, and then we graphically connect the two together. And how, just as with the co-evolutionary tree, the tanglegram, how often these lines, these collecting lines, cross over each other, give a visual indication of how congruent or how similar the trees, or in this case, the tree and the map, the geography, are. Okay? So if the pattern of the tree was that this was always in the north and these were in the south, we would never get any overlap between those lines. Okay, so that's a graphical approach to showing trees and maps. So this is what I do. By the way, map tangle was a word I invented. Geophylogeny is a word I invented. These are my two claims to fame, and I'm hoping one day geophylogeny will actually end up in the Oxford English Dictionary, and then I can die. So, trees in geography, brown bears. This is just an example I use because it's nice and simple. Mitochondrial DNA in brown bears in Europe. Mitochondrial DNA, doesn't matter what it is. It's just one type of DNA. So we have a tree. It's a very simple tree here. And at the tip of each tree, we've got what we call the haplotype. It's just a measure of the variation of the DNA within the bears. We've got a map where we took samples of bears. Sometimes, not me personally, I've never caught a bear in my life. So these are where they took samples. And at each location, they may have sampled more than one bear. Each bear has a haplotype, so we've got a table here that is telling us which locations we saw which haplotypes. Okay? So in Finland, they saw the Rus haplotype, but in Slovenia, they sampled both the slow and the crow variants. Okay, so these are just variants. So we've got a tree, we've got a map, and we've got a table which tells us where we saw each tip of the tree. So the challenge is, how do we put the tree over the geography given that information? Now, each point on the tree, so if we think of the tree on my hand, if each tip of the tree has only been spotted in one place, then it's dead easy. You can take the tip of the tree, put the coordinates for where you observed the thing at the tip of the tree, the haplotype, on the tip of the tree, and you can place the tip of the tree geographically where you observed that thing, haplotype in this case. However, if you've observed it at multiple locations, so for example, Rus has been observed so Rus here, this one here, has been observed in several locations up here in Scandinavia. We've got multiple places on our map where we want our tip to be. So we have to decide, if we want to put the tree on the map, we have to decide on the basis of the distribution of points where we want to actually locate the tip. So basically what happens in a geophylogeny is we take the tree, we digitize the tree, we digitize the geographic locations, we take the data to say which locations we observe which tips in, we put that into a table. So we've got a map, a table, and a tree. We then chuck it into an algorithm. and I'll talk about the algorithms in a sec. Our algorithm, first of all, has to takes the tip positions of the nodes and places them somewhere on the map. So if we've got one tip observation, it's easy, we put that where it is. If we've got more than one, we have to do something a bit more complicated. We then have to decide where to put the internal nodes on the tree on the basis of some sort of algorithm. We then have to decide how to connect the nodes, the tips, and the internal nodes through to have a branch that connects them together, and then we might need to associate some attributes. So what we do is we take the map, the tree, and the information about where the trips are on the map, and we turn it into a 3D model. And this is what's created for the bears. So here's the root of the tree. Here's the internal nodes. These bears, 3D bear shapes, are the actual observations. So that's basically the method that's followed. But how do we do that? Okay, so there's a variety of algorithms that we can use to do that. So this is a simple example. We can just do an envelope centroid. Okay, so here's our tree. This is just a simple, we've got two terminal tips, one red, green, one blue. The orange one's our internal node. So here's the observations of the blue tip. So we've got 7 observations of the blue tip. So what we do is we just put a bounding box around those observations, and we put our tip in the middle center of the bounding box. And then we can connect our observations with a tip to observation line so that we know which observations go with which tip. And we do that same thing for the green. The green, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 observations. We put the tip in the center of the bounding box of those 4 and connect them with lines. For the internal nodes, we then take the bounding box. We can either take the bounding box of the tip nodes, or we could take the bounding box of the observations, and we can put our internal node at the centroid of that bounding box. And we can build that up until we've built up our entire tree. So that's one way of doing it. We can do a very similar thing, but weight do some kind of inverse distance weighting on the point. So we can take so rather than that being at the centroid, we do it at the weighted centroid of the observations. And we can do exactly the same for this, and we can build up the tree on the basis of weighted distances. We can do that. We can build on the basis of minimum convex polygons. So in this case, we've got our 2 sets of observations. We build a minimum convex polygon around our 2 sets of observations. We put our tip at the centroid of the minimum convex polygon. For the internal node, we then take the minimum convex polygon of all the observations that define that subtree and put our node at the center of that minimum convex polygon, build our way up the tree. Method 4, overlap disjunction analysis. This is so in this case, at the tips, we build minimum convex polygons around the tips. Don't worry about the details of this. To a certain extent, honestly, don't worry about the details. This is just so we build minimum convex polygons around the tips. For the internal node, we build a minimum convex polygon around the joint distribution of the 2 lower tips. If the 2 minimum convex polygons are disjunct, they don't overlap each other, we put the internal node in the center of the space between the 2 daughter ranges. If they overlap, we put it at the center of the overlapping area. And if one is enclosed by the other, we can put it in the center between the convex polygon of the enclosed set of observations and the enclosing set of observations. This one is the one that I'm going to show you some results for in due course. Finally, the fifth way we can build these things is not something that I do, but some colleagues elsewhere, Philippe Lamy, who's I think in Leuven in Belgium, he builds spatial temporal Bayesian dynamic models, basically very complicated statistical models that estimate, provide error messages for where to put the tree tips on the basis of the DNA variation and models of geography. Don't worry about the details, but you want to look it up, you can look up this paper. So basically he maps things like the spread of rabies variants and things like that. A lot of disease modeling, H5N1 bird flu they work on, and use similar systems for modeling how these pathogens move across the landscape. I don't do any of that, but you can apply these fancy statistical models. Personally, I think the fancy statistical models are more inspired guesswork than reality, but there you go. Many people will say that of mine. So the bottom line is there's many different ways to build these geophylogenies. A phylogeny is just what evolutionary scientists call evolutionary trees. Okay, do you want a break or do you want to just plow? I will try and fit it. I reckon we've got another half an hour. Do you want 5 minutes or? Okay, right, let's take a 5 minute stop. And yeah, I've been looking at this for years, so I could probably talk for days on this.
So, how is the
Well, we'll see in a minute. But because I create these, I mean, I hope in your head you can see that you've got these tree models with all this geographical information kind of hanging off them. And the question becomes, how, I told you about the processes, so we know we've got this idea of the processes. We've got an idea of what the history of the landscape is from geological maps and from this information that the water engineers have collected in the past. So we know something of the history of the landscape. We know we've got these models and we know where the fish live today reasonably well. We've got a model of what their relationships are, and what we're trying to do is to put those two histories together to create one coherent history. And the only way to do that, it's like doing a 3-dimensional or 4-dimensional jigsaw puzzle where you've lost half the pieces. So while in the past, people have tried to basically do sums, so they have trees and they have geography and they try and do a mathematical analysis to try and calculate history. Because different end products, different patterns that you observe today can have different histories, they've calculated their histories on the basis of a belief in how the world works, rather than on the basis of whether the data supports their view of what your important process is or not. So basically, I've got all this data on fish, data on things. How do I put it together? And one of the main ways is visually, is to look at this information and to put it together side by side and say, well, this fits with this. I might not have a statistic that tells me whether it statistically fits, but I can visually show these things. I know, I appreciate this. I was trying to work out how to talk to you about this without being... All right, good. Well, I have talked to many people in the past. Well, should we just, yeah, let's just go. Okay, so what have I done? What's the situation? I've built what I call a phylogeographical information system, which is a GIS database of phylogeographic and Earth history data. What am I doing with it? I'm searching for spatial and temporal congruence within biogeographical pattern. So congruence just means things that match up. Yeah. Within the biogeographic pattern, within this pattern of the trees, of the organisms and their geography, between the distribution of the geography of the trees and the events in Earth history that we know about, And how do we present this? Well, one way of identifying these things is through qualitative visualization. This is often the first way that I see something. And then when I've seen something, then I try and come up with some sort of statistical analysis to try and prove that. But the statistical analysis is often difficult to actually undertake. So the first thing is find the pattern, then try and explain it or try and verify it. So what data have I collected? So I've got data on the ranges of organisms, and that's a combination of distribution maps, point observations, and also a few information on fossils. So there are a few fossils for some of these organisms. I've got the evolutionary models. I've shown you the phylogenies, a phylogeny, an evolutionary tree, but I've also got other types of evolutionary models based on distance matrices and clusters and things like that. But I'm not going to talk to you about those at all. So we've got some other evolutionary data as well, but I'm not talking about that. From the evolutionary models and the range, I build geophylogenies using different algorithms, a variety of algorithms. I also have information on the ecology and behavior of organisms as well, because that's interesting, useful contextual information. Lots of base mapping, not surprisingly, the infrastructure, just sort of roads, rails, things like that. Gazettas, very important, because I've been, I go through old papers written in sometimes in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and they say so-and-so was observed at this place, and then I have to go and find that place, which may be some small village in central Mexico. So the gazettas and things are really useful in tracking down where these descriptions are. And we've got a variety of digital globe imagery. Then regarding the environment, I've got the topography at 1 km resolution from the STRM, Shuttle Topography Radar Mission. Hopefully you're familiar with that now. Incredibly good for this kind of work. 30 meter STRM, and then 1 kilometer for sort of continental scale studies. Information on the hydrology, so the modern channels, any information on paleo channels, channels that used to exist that don't exist anymore, lakes that exist and don't exist anymore. Trying to put together from the channels and the lakes to build a model of the watersheds. All right, we know where the watersheds roughly are today at quite a high resolution now. In fact, part of this, my work has involved building the most accurate hydrological model of central Mexico that, as far as I know, has been built. But also interested in things like the features in the hydrology, the geomorphological features in the hydrology that are indicative of changes in river flow in the past. So, remember river capture. We've got a steep channel, a shallow channel. This one erodes into this one, captures the flow. The steep channel, because the one that eroded in is steep, and the one that was eroded into is not so steep, you get a change in the river's longitudinal steepness, what's called a nick point. So I've been looking for nick points across the river network of central Mexico because they're indicative of a river capture event. And if I find a nick point, then I can try and find the river capture event that created the nick point. Also things like waterfalls. As I say, they may be barriers for dispersal. All sorts of the other features that are the result of changes in river valleys. So things like hanging valleys, narrows and gorges, things like this. These are geomorphological signatures of past hydrological change. The geology as well, the surface geology map, radioisotope dates, local site maps, estimates of paleovolcanism. I collected it all on a magpie. So I've got this huge database. I was going to show you the live database, but it was so slow on the machine in my office that I decided I couldn't do it. It was just impractical, and I need a very big machine that I have at home to actually show this information. So the basic approach is this. I've got information on the Earth history, information on the organism. I build a model of the phylogeographic pattern, and also models of the history of volcanism and the history of the river channels. So I build models of those. I then try and compare them, compare the phylogeographic pattern to the Earth history pattern. Then, so we build those, we put those together. We then try and find spatial and temporal congruence between bits of the pattern, bits of the phylogeographic pattern, and bits of the Earth history pattern. And then we try and, once we've identified pattern, we try and infer the causes of that pattern, the drivers. Is this the result of volcanism? Is this the result of erosion? Is this, so, and once we've got the drivers and we can start recreating the history. That's the idea. So let's get some practical examples at last. Mount Colima, stratovolcano, large eruptive volcano, the one we saw right at the beginning. This is an example that doesn't involve evolution at all particularly. Here's the distribution of one species, Alatoca zonistius. Here is a watershed between two basins. This is one basin, this is the other basin, okay? This is a large volcano. The rivers are flowing south off the slopes of the volcano, down south. If you can see here, this is the modern watershed in brown, and then it goes into purple up here. That's the modern watershed. We can see that this channel flows down here, down here, down here, and then abruptly turns 90 degrees to the right, to the left. This one's on the left, on the other side, on the eastern side, they're flowing down, parallel, 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 they turn, and then suddenly they turn south, okay? Notice that two of the observations of this species are on this side of the watershed, all the others are on this side of the watershed, and indeed there are observations of this species elsewhere in this watershed. So these are the only two observations just over the watershed in this basin. So what I did was I found a paper, two papers, so I collected information. So when I saw this pattern, I thought, ooh, that's interesting. How do these, something must have happened for these species to be in both watersheds, basins. They must have dispersed or got across somehow. So how did that happen? So if we look at this line of the river, what it looks like, 90 degrees bends are one of the characteristic signatures of a river capture event in the past. Something has changed direction it flowed. So it looks to me, to a certain extent, so it looked to me, so I saw this pattern, this 90 degree bend here, this 90 degree bend here. So it makes me think that this river, this channel here, used to flow like that. And if that was the case, that explains how these populations are here, because this side of the volcano used to be part of this watershed. Okay? So this channel used to flow down through there. So how do I demonstrate that that is in fact correct? Well, one of the things that I did was I looked at the geological evidence. So my geological map from Luca Ferrari, the extent of quaternary relatively recent volcanism is this red line. So we can see that the eruption from this volcano has basically fired out ejecta all the way down here over the during the quaternary, so the last quaternary, only 20,000 years, something like that. A scientific paper, particularly to do with Mount Colima, had another map, which has a map of what's called the Paleofugo debris flow deposits of 10,000 years ago, and that's the purple. So this was a later eruption than what the red is showing. And we can see that the point at which the river channel, this putative river capture event has occurred, is outside of the extent of the Paleofugo, the 10,000-year-old eruption, but within the area of the quaternary eruption. One of the other signatures I've mentioned is Nick Point. Here's this channel here. The hypothesis is this channel eroded into this relatively soft eruptive material, and eventually, well, either this got blocked Either what happened was this eruption blocked this channel, and therefore maybe the water started flowing down that way, which caused erosion into this channel. So we've got a deep river channel here. Or this channel eroded up by headward erosion into that river channel and did an erosive river capture. So the actual process may be the result of an eruption or a result of a headward erosion. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter to me because I'm interested simply that it occurred. And if we look at the longitudinal, so if we take a longitudinal profile, and this is all done in GIS, so if I took a longitudinal profile, the elevation all the way down this river channel here, plotted it here, so this is the distance downstream. This line indicates where the turn is here. And you can see that this is very steep down the slopes of the volcano. Then we get this kind of bumpy bit as we go through this is this deep channel flowing south here. And there isn't strong evidence for a nick point, I must say, on this one, but on other profiles that I've done, I do get strong evidence. So the take-home message here is that we don't exactly know how this created, but we do know it probably occurred. It wasn't the result of the 10,000-year-old eruption, but it is, so it's older than 10,000 years, but it is quaternary. So it's quaternary, but not within 10,000 years. That had never been seen before. That was a discovery through visualization. Nobody had ever documented, or I've not come across any documentation of this river capture event before. This is something I discovered through visualization. So I've done that all over the place. So what I'm trying to do is to create a map of all these events across the entire region. And this is sort of the situation where I'm presently at the moment. These are all the change events that I've managed to map out so far. There's Zilwan. There's that lava blockage that I showed you earlier. That's here. And we've got various others. So I'm creating this space-time map. And some of these divisions, these are where we've got splitting events in the. So this is the Mias. This is the rivers during the Pliocene, used to flow down there. Then what happened was there was a volcanic eruption that blocked this channel, and then that paleo lake formed behind it. So I'm creating this space-time model of the change in the hydrological network through time, through looking at the geological evidence, looking at each particular site, looking at the profile of the river, getting the profile from my high-resolution hydrological model and my high-resolution terrain models, collating all this evidence about what is the evidence for this event having occurred, how can we pin down the date for these events. Okay, so that's the hydrology. This is my geophylogeny built from the 31 species of Gudaids using the overlap disjunction analysis. So that's these are the paleo river channels. So I've got this kind of stuff, and then that's just flat without time. And then I've got this 3D tree, and I've got so I've got the channels, I've got the history events, the changing between those channels. It's all partial information. So what I'm looking for now is correlations between the pattern, the geography of the tree, and those historical events. For example, in this diagram, this is obviously a 3D space-time diagram, the red are where you've got spaces between the ranges of two subclades, so closely related species. Okay, so this is a space. So these two green ones, all these thin lines are connecting the tree to the observations. And this, for example, this is the break between the distributions of these two species, and it actually maps pretty well onto the division between these two subclades. What I'm really showing you is this is quite complicated. A lot of data, difficult to, and this ability to juxtaposition these things in space and time against each other in a 3D environment and in a map is really helpful to try and track down the patterns that are in there. And this is the kind of thing that I do on a map. This is the same thing on a map. This is just one species. So this is the distribution of one clade, this group blue here. Here's another one. And these are two nodes of a tree. Here's the overlap between those two species, and here's the internal node in the middle. These are the branches going up either side. Here's an example of a disjunct range. Here's one species. Here it's his closest relative, and the red is the space between the ranges. And we're looking for the congruence between the space between the ranges and geological events, and also to a certain extent between overlap and geological events. All these blue lines are where I'm estimating rivers flowed in the past. So rivers used to flow that way, used to flow that way. The various symbols are these geomorphological features in the landscape that I'm tying into the various river capture events. So these orange crosses are very low watersheds, so where the difference between the one valley and another is very shallow rather than a big steep mountain or something like that. And these are indicative that they maybe represent old channel locations where you used to have rivers flowing. So this is kind of what my database looks like in our map. And I'm looking for, so if I've got disjunct ranges, okay, spaces between ranges, then that may be the result of a vicariance event. Remember, vicariance events are widespread species split by a new barrier. So I'm looking for barriers, new barriers that formed within these disjunct areas. Where you've got high degree of overlap, and this is quite low overlap, that may be where you've got speciation occurring where the animals live together, maybe through some kind of sexual selection or something like that. So those are the kinds of patterns that I'm looking at and visualizing. So we'll just really quickly go through and see some of the results. So often, as I kind of trying to keep putting over to you, the best way to see pattern is you kind of want to boil it down to the absolute minimum. What those 3D diagrams and that map, this and this, are very, very complicated. There's lots of information there, and that's great for me because I know the data. I can explore it. I can point and click in here and get the information with the, the information tools. I can explore that data, and it's fine for that to be really complicated because that's what I'm doing. I'm exploring a complicated data space. But when it comes to explaining things, that's not actually very useful. And this is far more useful. So here's simply, let's start to get in and see some of the actual pattern in this data, which is so difficult to see in that complex, and those complex maps. So here, this is how much overlap we've got between what we call sister species, ones with a common ancestor. So we've got some that have very low overlap, zero overlap. And then we've got some with lots of overlap, but we don't have many that sort of partially overlap. So we've immediately, by putting it onto a graph and simply plotting the number of the nodes that we have and how much overlap between we've got the geography at each node, we can see that we've got lots of disjunct ones, lots of highly overlapping areas, and not many that are partially overlapping, which suggests to me instantly that we've got pattern in the landscape that's the result of history, because we've got lots of disjunct events. We can also plot against age. Okay, so this is overlap in each node against age. And we can see that we get high overlap, or we get disjunctions between nodes, between groups of species all the way through time. But we only really get high overlap mostly 5 million years and longer ago. So we've not got much high overlap in the modern times. And indeed, we've got this big area in here again that we see that we've got very few kind of medium overlap species. It's not looking like it's random. I think that's the thing. So that's a simple thing. Okay. Oh, God, this is taking forever. Right. Volcanoes. Luca Ferrari, Italian-Mexican geologist, has mapped out the history of volcanism in central Mexico and produced these maps in a journal of tecton physics. So here's the distribution of volcanism from radioisotope dates in the early to late Miocene, the late Miocene to Pliocene, 7 to 3 million years ago, and effectively the modern day. So we've got volcanism occurring in different places at different times. The question I want to know is speciation greater where you've got volcanism going on in a particular place at a particular time than when you haven't got volcanism going on? So have we got speciation going on here, but not over here, which would be expected because volcanism changes the landscape, changes the flow of the rivers, and therefore will induce speciation. So what I've done is I've taken his geological maps, digitized them, and in this case displaying them as 3D space-time volumes. Okay, so the white is where we've got volcanism in time. So this is the modern day, down the bottom. Each line is 5 million years. So that's 5 million years ago, 10 million years ago, 20 million years ago. So in the modern day, we've got a large amount of volcanism across central Mexico, the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt, and we can see that previously we had periods where there wasn't much volcanism here. These plains here, the red and the green, are the overlapping and disjunct areas between my plates. So what I'm looking for is, are the red ones, which are the disjunctions, are they more common in areas of volcanism than the green ones, which are where you've got overlap? Because disjunct may be produced by changes in the landscape which split species ranges. The purple dots are the dates of the potassium argon or the radioisotope dates that go with the geological map. So the question is, I can look at that visually, and I actually can see, when I spin it round in 3D, I can actually see that the green ones I think the green ones look like they're less associated with the volcanism than the orange ones. I think the orange ones are embedded more in the volcanism than the green ones. But can I prove that? Can I show that? Because that's how I've seen, but how do I demonstrate that? How else can I look at that data? This is another question, because I look at this data in many different ways. So this is my attempt. I'm going to answer that question in a minute, but this slide is just my latest attempt to put the geography on the tree and the volcanism as well. So we've got the volcanism up this side, we've got the various subtrees of the fish, and we've got the overlap areas plotted on this. So this is another alternative way of visualizing the data, and may be suitable for a publication, but I don't actually find it very useful for seeing overall patterns and things like that. I find the individual maps are too disjunct. It's difficult to see the relationship because of the way they're placed in relation to the nodes. It's kind of difficult to see the overall pattern, I think, in that kind of approach. The tree annotation approach with actual maps on the tree annotation. I've also made videos of this in the past with an attempt to show how the volcanism, to see how these disjunct areas, how the tree builds in space and in time, and how these disjunct areas relate to the geography. And I won't show those, but I've got some videos for those. Okay, let's just ignore that. So, perhaps I'm not the best at the organisation. Okay, so going back, let's just reverse back there. So remember this tree with the disjunct areas and the overlapping areas. Okay, so this is just taking all these disjunct areas. All these red ones are the areas where the species are separated geographically. The green is where you've got overlapping groups. And if we look at the distribution, the spatial distribution of the disjunctions, we can see that they're very much orientated sort of round and about the Lema-Santiago Basin, which is basically the main basin in the southern uplands of Mexico. And unsurprisingly, a lot of the splits in distributions that we see correlate to present-day watersheds. That's highly expected. You'd expect it. Ranges used to be across the present-day watersheds. The watersheds form, so therefore we get the disjunctions across those watersheds. They correlate very strongly with the watersheds, with the edge of the central Mexican plateau here. Now, look at this one between Mezcal and Santiago. It's straight on top of the present-day watershed. Look at it, them all concentrating along the watershed here. And we can contrast that with overlap. And so here we're mapping the overlapping ranges of the sister clays, and we can see they're all concentrated around the present-day Lake Chapala. This blue line is the estimated extent of the Paleo Lake system in the Pliocene, late Miocene. And we can see when we plot this out quite well, we get a reasonable visual correspondence between overlap and the lake, and between watersheds and disjunction. Very much suggesting that overlap is driven by the flat areas, the ability to distribute, to disperse across in this lake system, whereas these disjunctions are the result of geological changes to the connectivity in the hydrological network, in the river network. Very contrasting patterns between the two. When we plot if I take the centroids of these areas of disjunction between ranges, I'm sure you're holding on here, and I plot them against time, I take the northing, so I've got the northing here and the date of each disjunction, and I've taken the centroid of the disjunction. We can see that through time, these disjunctions have moved from north to south. It is a significant pattern. It's not particularly strong, but it does exist. It's statistically, that is a statistically sound pattern. And that matches up to what we know of the geological history of the area. So basically in the north, it started in the north. The ancient species, first of all, got split in the north, and then that splitting moved to the south through time. So we can burn the north-south split. We won't bother with that. Okay. The other thing that I did to test, we'll ignore the first one, because that's not insignificant. So through the visual examination of the pattern, I come up with the hypothesis that where you've got volcanism, you should have increased hydrological change, which would lead to increased variation of vicariance, increased speciation due to vicariance, and you would end up with more disjunct or low overlap between related clades in areas of volcanism than you would in areas without volcanism. So to try and prove this, I took the amount of overlap at each node between the ranges, and I took the proportion of the parent minimum convex polygon that is volcanic, and I plot the two against each other. So basically, more volcanism equals more likely to be the result of splitting of the ranges and divergence. And I get a significant fit. It's relatively low R squared. It's not explaining a huge amount, but you do get a significant fit to your data, which says that when you get more volcanism, you're getting your ranges, that the ranges of the resultant species of a speciation event are more likely to be different from each other when they're in a volcanic area than when they're not in a volcanic area. And if we poke all the data a bit, throw away some dodgy data points, we actually get a much, much stronger fit. So at the end of the day, what I'm showing here is that overall, I think we can prove that the pattern in the distribution of space occupied by species through time and how they've diverged is correlated to the amount of volcanism. Doesn't mean that every speciation event in the history of the fish is driven by volcanism, is the result of volcanism. But it does mean that overall volcanism is an important process in the evolution of the fish. More volcanism, more speciation, or more of a particular type of speciation. All right, I think we've had quite enough of all this, but lessons learned. Okay, visualizing spatial and temporal data can be difficult and time-consuming. You've got to decide what data to show, what symbolization to use, and deal with major problems of occlusion when you've got these large data sets, multiple raster layers and things like this that you're trying to relate in there. And that's even before you've started to deal with incorporating spatial and temporal uncertainty into your data. I haven't shown you my attempts to put spatial temporal uncertainty into these data sets, but it gets ridiculous, the amount of information that you're trying to show. So it really does take a long time to do this, and it takes trial and error. So don't expect the first thing that you do to reveal all. I look at all those different ways that I've used and looked at this data, and each one of them generally shows me a different thing, reveals different pattern. So look at your data in multiple different ways. Interaction is extremely helpful when exploring large and complex data sets and for discovering new relationships. But remember, when you're publishing information or disseminating information, you are unlikely to be able to provide that interaction to your reader. So you've got to think of, it may be extremely useful for you as a private exploration of your data, but when it comes to actually communicating the patterns that you've discovered, you have to be as simple as possible. Condense it down to simple graphs. One of the problems I have is I've condensed that down into a simple graph, but how do I communicate what that graph is actually showing to the rest of you? That's one of my problems, is that I've digested it, I've boiled it down to a graph, which is showing a simple pattern, but how I got to that simple graph is something that the reader has to understand as well. Simplicity versus complexity. Complex visualizations take a lot of time to create. They have high wow factor, but may be difficult to understand without expert knowledge. Okay, so I've done that already, and the ability to explore and interact with them. For explanation, often best to summarize a pattern as a simple graphic. Data management. All my 3D models are hard-coded rather than dynamically rendered from data. So for example, those trees with all that geography, if I want to change it, I have to edit the actual shape file rather than just telling it to be rendered in a different way in ArcGIS. So I'm forever rebuilding multiple versions of the 3D models rather than taking one data set and then rendering it, displaying it in different ways. And when it comes to editing these models, 3D editing in ArcGIS has become a lot better in the last couple of releases, but say 5 years ago it was really awkward to do 3D editing in ArcGIS. Now it's much better. Small multiples. Tree annotation, very complicated to read, but all data is presented in a single view. So it can be, as again, it's complicated data sets. The time series of volcanism works much better, okay? Minimize occlusion, easy to, blah, blah. Graphics, so the tree annotation diagram is created in Inkspace with exported maps. I can't do that really very efficiently in ArcGIS. So you've got the problems of separating your graphic presentations from the underlying data. If you decide you want to change something in, say, the maps, and this happened to me before, I made some set of maps, but I'd made a mistake. I ended up having to recreate all the maps, export them out, put them back into Inkscape, etc., etc. Space-time cube is great for seeing overall pattern in space and time, but has to be viewed interactively, really, or as a sort of fly-by movie to communicate that 3D juxtaposition of objects. The fixed Z limits are a real problem for exploration. I'd love to be able to pick up my nodes and slide them in time up and down visually to look for, identify correlations between, for example, my time estimates for some of my events may be 5 million years out. So I want to be able to move things up and down, try and arrange them so that they fit visually as best as possible, but that's really difficult given that I can't just pick things up and move objects in ArcGIS and easily move them about. And real problems with difficulties with labeling and adding furniture to ArcScene 3D diagrams. There's a real problem there. They don't supply standard things like legend tools and scale bars and things for ArcScene. Animation, didn't show you those, but no interaction. Takes quite a time to make, especially complicated animations. Often you put them into movie editing software to add additional information or commentary to your animations to make them more explanatory. They're good for explanation, good for outreach as well. People like to see 3D. They like to see animations, even though they may not be, let's say, receiving the message. It at least grabs their attention.